Another use for the stories about miracles in the New Testament is a way of showing that Jesus is greater than people in the Old Testament. Jesus succeeds in places where people fail in Old Testament stories, or he exceeds the scope of the miracles that appear in the Old Testament. So in Matthew 8, Jesus is depicted as being in a boat and sleeping during a storm, and his disciples wake him up and say, "Don't you want to help us out here? We're gonna die in this in a shipwreck in this storm if something doesn't happen." And so Jesus gets up and he is able to say some magic words which instantly calm the storm. That story would have absolutely triggered the memories of the Old Testament story about Jonah for the readers of the Gospels. In the book of Jonah, Jonah is also found on a ship, not going to where God had asked him to go. And they're in this ship that Jonah is on, which is getting him away from wherever God is sending him. That ship hits a storm also, and it looks as though everybody is going to die. And the people who are navigating with the boat ask everybody to pray to their gods, because the assumption is that the storm is divine punishment for somebody on the boat. Jonah doesn't want to say that it's probably him, but he eventually does. And against the wishes of the sailor, he insists that they throw him off of the boat. As soon as Jonah hits the water, the storm is over, and a giant sea creature swallows him up and takes him to where God asked Jonah to go, which is the city of Nineveh. In the Gospels, Jesus is able to stop that storm simply by his words. So if you compare Jonah, who has to be thrown in the water, to Jesus, who is able to calm a storm with his words, you can see how much greater Jesus is even than a revered person like Jonah in the New Testament. The same thing is the case when Jesus feeds the 5,000. This miracle story appears in all four of the Gospels. But as people read the story, they would have been reminded of a story in the Old Testament where one of the greatest prophets, a prophet named Elisha, also is in a situation where he feeds a group of his prophets with a small amount of barley bread. Remember that barley is being used. Barley bread also appears in some of the feeding of the 5,000 stories in the New Testament. So if you look at 2 Kings 4, Elisha feeds 100 men with a small amount of barley bread, which is miraculous in itself. But in the New Testament, Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a small amount of barley bread and some fish. So Jesus is shown to be much greater even than Elisha, which is quite a statement in the minds of Jewish people. So the purpose of that story is probably to show that Jesus is even greater than any of the prophets of the past in Jewish history.